That's the title of today's story. And I want you to know something right up front. Every word of what I'm about to tell you actually happened. This isn't some Hollywood fantasy or internet legend. This is about a woman named Evelyn Luna, and about 37 minutes that changed everything at Roosevelt High School in Springfield, Ohio. They thought she was just another quiet teacher. They had no idea what they were dealing with. If this story moves you like it moved me, I'd be so grateful if you'd hit that like button and subscribe to help me reach more people who need to hear stories like this. Drop a comment too. I read every single one. And if you're feeling generous, there's a thanks button below where you can help me keep bringing you these real stories that matter. Your support means everything and helps me continue sharing tales that inspire and give hope to those who need it most. Thank you for being here. Let me take you back to October 15th. Last year, it was one of those crisp Ohio mornings where the leaves were just starting to turn. And there was that particular smell in the air that reminded you autumn was settling in for good. Roosevelt High School looked exactly like what you'd picture when someone says, American High School. Red brick, wide hallways, rows of blue lockers, and that institutional lighting that somehow made everyone look slightly tired. Evelyn Luna was walking down the main corridor at 7:15 a.m., her sensible flats making soft tapping sounds on the polished linoleum. She carried her lesson plans in a worn leather bag, the same bag she'd carried textbooks in during her teaching credential program 3 years earlier, after she'd made the decision to leave her previous career behind. If you passed Evelyn in that hallway, you'd see exactly what the students saw: a woman in her late 20s with dark hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, wearing a cardigan over dark slacks, moving with the purposeful but unhurried pace of someone who belonged in an academic setting. You might notice she was pretty in an understated way, the kind of person who probably looked good without makeup, but wore it anyway out of professional habit. What you wouldn't see, what nobody at Roosevelt High School knew except for one person, was the thin, white scar that ran along her left shoulder blade, or the way her eyes automatically scanned every room she entered, cataloging exits and potential threats. You wouldn't notice how she positioned herself with her back to walls whenever possible, or how her seemingly relaxed posture could shift into something entirely different in less than a second. Evelyn had been teaching chemistry at Roosevelt for exactly 8 months, and in that time, she'd established herself as the kind of teacher students either loved or found intimidatingly competent. She knew her subject matter inside and out. She was fair with grades, and she had this way of explaining complex concepts that made them click for kids who'd been struggling with science for years. But there was something else about Miss Luna that set her apart from the other teachers, something the students couldn't quite put their finger on. It was the way she carried herself. Maybe. Or how she never seemed rattled by anything, not the day the Bunsen burner malfunctioned and filled her classroom with smoke. Not when Jason Hartwell had his panic attack during the midterm exam. Not even when the fire alarm had gone off the previous month, and she'd shepherded her students out of the building with a calm efficiency that had impressed the other faculty. She's got this vibe. Madison Fisher had told her friend Chloe the week before, as they watched Miss Luna setting up for her advanced chemistry class. Like, she's really nice and everything, but sometimes when she looks at you, it's like she's seeing more than just, regular teacher stuff. Madison was 17, a junior with straight brown hair and the kind of quiet intelligence that sometimes made her a target. She'd been in Miss Luna's third period class since the beginning of the semester, and she'd developed something close to hero worship for the teacher who'd actually made chemistry make sense for the first time in her academic career. What Madison didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Evelyn Luna had spent 6 years as a Navy SEAL before she ever set foot in a classroom. She'd been deployed twice to Afghanistan, had completed missions that remained classified, and had earned commendations that gathered dust in a storage unit she rented across town. She'd saved lives and taken them, had crawled through mud and sand in places most Americans couldn't find on a map, and had learned to operate with lethal efficiency in situations that would traumatize most people for life. She'd also lost someone whose death still woke her up at 3 a.m. sometimes, sweating and reaching for weapons that weren't there. That was why she'd left the Navy. That was why she'd chosen teaching. "I want to save people a different way," she'd told her commanding officer during her exit interview. "I want to build instead of destroy." For 8 months. That plan had worked beautifully. Evelyn loved her students, loved watching their faces when a difficult concept finally clicked, loved the rhythm of academic life with its predictable schedules and clear objectives. She felt like she was healing, like she was building the quiet, purposeful life she'd promised herself she would create. But Evelyn Luna had made one critical error in her transition to civilian life. She'd underestimated how cruel 17-year-olds could be when they sensed weakness. And Benjamin Kennedy had been watching her very carefully. Benjamin was 18, a senior who should have graduated the previous spring, but had been held back due to what his father diplomatically called academic challenges. He was 6'2", with the kind of broad-shouldered build that came from playing football until his grades made him ineligible. And he had the particular brand of arrogance that develops in young men who've never faced real consequences for their actions. His father, Frederick Kennedy, was not just the principal of Roosevelt High School. He was also a member of the city council and had political aspirations that everyone in Springfield knew about. Benjamin had grown up understanding that rules were suggestions, that authority figures could be manipulated, and that his last name provided a buffer between him and any serious trouble. He'd been testing that buffer for years. There had been incidents, missed assignments that somehow got recorded as turned in, suspensions that became administrative leave, complaints from other students that disappeared into filing cabinets. Benjamin Kennedy was the kind of student teachers warned each other about in the faculty lounge, but always in whispers. He'd been watching Miss Luna since her first day at Roosevelt, waiting for an opportunity to establish dominance the way he had with every other teacher who'd tried to hold him accountable. The opportunity had come during her 3rd week, when she'd given him a 0 on a lab report he hadn't completed. "I was sick that day," he'd told her, leaning against her desk with the casual confidence of someone who'd never had an excuse rejected. "You were in my class that day, Benjamin," Evelyn had replied, not looking up from the papers she was grading. "You chose not to do the work." That's when Benjamin Kennedy decided Miss Luna needed to learn her place. It started small, the way these things always do. A few snide comments during class. Just loud enough for other students to hear, but quiet enough that calling him out would seem like an overreaction. Comments about how some teachers tried too hard, or how nobody really cares about chemistry anyway, when those didn't provoke the reaction he wanted. Benjamin escalated. He started arriving late to class, making a show of disrupting lessons with loudly whispered conversations with his friends. He forgot to bring his textbook, then spent class time asking to borrow materials from other students. He submitted assignments that were obviously copied from internet sources, daring her to fail him. Evelyn handled it all with the same calm professionalism she brought to everything else. She documented every incident, followed school protocol, and tried to engage Benjamin in private conversations about his potential. She'd dealt with difficult personalities before, different context, obviously, but the principle was the same. Stay calm. Follow procedure. Don't take it personally. But Benjamin Kennedy wasn't just a difficult personality. He was something else entirely. The real escalation began in September, when Evelyn assigned a group project worth 20% of the semester grade. Benjamin's group turned in work that was clearly plagiarized, not just inspired by internet sources, but literally copied and pasted, complete with hyperlinks still embedded in the text. Evelyn gave the entire group zeros and required them to redo the assignment. For most of the students, this was embarrassing but manageable. For Benjamin, whose GPA was already hovering dangerously close to the line that would make college admission impossible, it was a declaration of war. "You can't do this," he'd said, standing in front of her desk after class while his friends waited in the hallway. "My dad is the principal. You know that, right?" Evelyn had looked up from her gradebook, meeting his eyes with the steady gaze that had once been used to assess enemy combatants. "Your father being the principal doesn't change the fact that your work was plagiarized. Benjamin, the assignment needs to be completed honestly, or the grade stands." For just a moment, something flickered across Benjamin's face. Surprise, maybe, or recognition that he'd encountered someone who wouldn't be intimidated. Then his expression hardened into something uglier. "We'll see about that," he'd said. That's when the real campaign began. It started with technology. Benjamin Kennedy might have been failing chemistry, but he was extremely skilled with social media and digital manipulation. Within a week, a fake Instagram account appeared with Evelyn's name and photo, posting inappropriate content designed to look like a teacher engaging in unprofessional behavior. The account was reported and removed quickly, but not before screenshots were circulated among students. Then came the emails, messages sent to the school administration from fake accounts, making vague but concerning allegations about Evelyn's conduct. Nothing specific enough to warrant formal investigation, but troubling enough to create whispers in faculty meetings. Benjamin's friends joined the effort. Alex Morrison, whose father owned the largest car dealership in Springfield, started spreading rumors about seeing Miss Luna at bars on school nights. Acting unprofessionally. David Chen, no relation to any of the students, despite sharing a common surname with several families in the area, began making comments in other classes about how Miss Luna played favorites and was probably too young to really understand teaching. The thing about small communities like Springfield is that reputations matter enormously, and they can be destroyed much faster than they can be built. Evelyn began noticing the changes immediately. Other teachers became less friendly during lunch breaks. Parents who had previously praised her teaching at parent-teacher conferences started asking pointed questions about her qualifications. Diana Peterson, the assistant principal who had been supportive during Evelyn's first months, began scheduling check-in meetings that felt more like evaluations. But the worst part wasn't the professional damage. The worst part was how Benjamin and his friends made every single day at Roosevelt High School feel like a psychological battlefield. They would gather outside her classroom before the bell rang, talking loudly about how some teachers think they're better than everyone else, or discussing plans for showing people what happens when they don't play along. During class, they would exchange looks and whisper comments just loud enough to disrupt her lessons, but just quiet enough that disciplining them would seem petty. Benjamin started arriving at school early and staying late, making sure he was always somewhere in Evelyn's vicinity, not close enough to be accused of harassment, but close enough to create the constant feeling of being watched. He would appear in hallways she needed to walk through, show up in the teacher's parking lot when she was leaving for the day, even start frequenting the coffee shop across from her apartment building. The message was clear. We can get to you anywhere, anytime, for someone with Evelyn's background. This kind of psychological warfare was particularly devastating. In the military, threats were direct and responses were clear. Enemy combatants didn't hide behind institutional protections or social manipulation. When someone wanted to hurt you, they tried to hurt you, and you could respond accordingly. But at Roosevelt High School, the rules were completely different. Benjamin Kennedy wasn't an enemy combatant. He was a student, a minor, the principal's son. He had rights and protections that limited how Evelyn could respond. Every action she took had to be measured against school policy, legal liability, and the complex dynamics of small-town politics. So she did what she'd been trained to do in her new profession. She documented everything, followed proper channels, and tried to maintain professional boundaries. She kept detailed records of every incident, reported concerns to the appropriate administrators, and attempted to address the situation through official means. What she didn't realize was that Benjamin Kennedy had been playing this particular game much longer than she had, and he understood the rules better than she did. Every complaint she filed was met with requests for more documentation. Every incident she reported was minimized as teenage behavior or misunderstandings. When she asked for support from the administration, she was told that perhaps she needed to work on her classroom management skills or consider whether teaching was really the right fit for someone with her background. Frederick Kennedy, Benjamin's father and the school's principal, was masterful at threading the needle between protecting his son and maintaining plausible deniability. He never explicitly dismissed Evelyn's concerns, but he managed to ensure that nothing substantial was ever done about them. "Benjamin can be challenging," he'd said during one of their meetings, sitting behind his desk with the kind of practiced empathy that came from years in educational administration. "But he's also dealing with some difficult personal issues this year. College pressure. You know how it is. Sometimes these boys just need a little extra patience while they work through their transitions." The subtext was clear. Benjamin Kennedy's comfort was more important than Evelyn Luna's professional well-being. October brought a new level of escalation. Benjamin's campaign moved beyond social media and whispered rumors into direct interference with Evelyn's work. Lab equipment began malfunctioning in suspicious ways. Not broken, exactly, but tampered with enough to disrupt lessons and create safety concerns. Chemical supplies went missing, forcing Evelyn to modify experiments or cancel them entirely. Someone gained access to her classroom after hours and rearranged materials, moved furniture, and left subtle signs that her space had been violated. Nothing was stolen or destroyed, but the message was unmistakable. Your sanctuary isn't safe. The psychological toll was enormous. Evelyn found herself checking and double-checking locks, arriving early to inspect her classroom for signs of intrusion, staying late to secure materials that should have been perfectly safe in a locked school building. She started having trouble sleeping, her military training keeping her alert for threats that materialized in 17-year-old faces rather than combat zones. For the first time since leaving the Navy, Evelyn Luna began to wonder if she'd made a terrible mistake. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd survived deployments in Afghanistan, had operated in genuinely life-threatening situations with calm professionalism, had earned the respect of some of the most elite warriors in the American military. But a group of teenagers in Ohio were making her question her competence and her future. That's the thing about bullying that people often don't understand, especially when it happens to adults. It's not about physical strength or combat skills or professional qualifications. It's about power dynamics and social manipulation and the grinding. Relentless pressure of being targeted by people who understand the system better than you do. Benjamin Kennedy understood that system perfectly. He knew exactly how far he could push without crossing lines that would trigger serious consequences. He knew which administrators would protect him and which teachers would look the other way, rather than risk conflict with the principal's family. He knew that Evelyn's military background, which should have been an asset, could be weaponized against her by people who whispered about whether someone with that kind of training was really suitable for working with children. Most importantly, he knew that time was on his side. The semester was progressing. His grades were improving thanks to some creative administrative intervention, and graduation was only months away. All he had to do was maintain pressure until either Evelyn quit or made a mistake he could exploit. What Benjamin Kennedy didn't know was that Evelyn Luna had faced much more dangerous enemies than him, and she was starting to remember who she really was underneath the cardigan and lesson plans. The transformation began subtly, in ways that probably weren't visible to anyone else, but felt seismic to Evelyn. She started arriving at school 15 minutes earlier than necessary, not for preparation, but for reconnaissance. She began varying her routes through the building, noting which hallways offered the best sightlines and which areas were most isolated. She found herself assessing her colleagues differently, identifying potential allies, and recognizing threats she'd been too naive to see before. Vincent Walker, the physical education teacher, caught her attention during a faculty meeting in early October. He was probably in his 40s, with the kind of bearing that suggested military service. And she noticed how he positioned himself in meetings, how his eyes tracked movement around the room after the meeting. She approached him. "Were you military?" she asked quietly. Vincent studied her for a moment before nodding. "Marines, 2 tours in Iraq. You—" "Navy," Evelyn said, 6 years. They didn't need to say anything else. Vincent had noticed the subtle signs of Benjamin's campaign against Evelyn, and he understood what was happening in ways that civilian educators might not. From that point forward, she had at least one ally who understood the stakes, but having an ally didn't solve the fundamental problem. Benjamin Kennedy was still escalating his campaign, and the October 15th fire drill was approaching. If you've ever been systematically targeted by someone who wants to destroy your life, you know what those last few days felt like for Evelyn. There was a sense of inevitability, like watching storm clouds gather on the horizon and knowing that no amount of preparation would completely shield you from what was coming. Benjamin had been laying groundwork for something bigger. His friends had been asking pointed questions about fire drill procedures, about which teachers were responsible for which areas of the building, about timing and logistics that seemed oddly specific for typical teenage curiosity. Evelyn noticed the questions because her military training had taught her to notice when people gathered intelligence, even when they were trying to be subtle about it. She mentioned her concerns to Vincent, who agreed that something felt off but couldn't identify any specific policy violations. On October 14th, the day before the scheduled fire drill, Benjamin Kennedy stayed after chemistry class. "Miss Luna," he said, approaching her desk while she packed up her materials, "I want you to know that I've learned a lot in your class this semester." There was something in his tone that made Evelyn look up sharply. Benjamin was smiling, but it wasn't a friendly expression. "I'm glad to hear that, Benjamin," she said carefully. "Yeah," he continued, "I've learned that sometimes people need to understand their place. And tomorrow, I think you're going to understand yours. If this reminds you of someone you knew in high school, someone who used fear and intimidation to control other people, then you understand the chill that ran down Evelyn's spine in that moment. Not because she was afraid of an 18-year-old student, but because she recognized the tone of someone who believed they held all the power. Benjamin Kennedy had no idea what kind of power he was actually dealing with, as October 15th dawned crisp and clear. Evelyn Luna stood in her apartment bathroom, looking at herself in the mirror while she got ready for what would become the most important day of her teaching career. She had no way of knowing that in approximately 8 hours, everything would change. She had no way of knowing that the quiet life she'd built for herself was about to collide spectacularly with the person she used to be. All she knew was that something was coming, and that 37 minutes of her life were about to remind an entire high school that some people are much more dangerous than they appear. The fire drill was scheduled for 10:15 a.m. Benjamin Kennedy thought he had everything planned perfectly. He had no idea what he was about to unleash. At 10:14 a.m. on October 15th, Evelyn Luna was standing in front of her advanced chemistry class, explaining the molecular structure of sodium chloride to 26 students who were more interested in the approaching fire drill than in ionic bonds. She'd noticed Benjamin Kennedy and his usual crew, Alex Morrison and David Chen, exchanging glances throughout the period. Their attention focused on something that definitely wasn't chemistry. The fire alarm began its piercing wail at exactly 10:15. "All right, everyone," Evelyn called over the noise, falling back on the practiced calm that had gotten her through countless emergency situations. "You know the drill. Leave everything where it is. Single file. Follow me to the east exit." Her students began filing out with the kind of orderly chaos that comes from monthly practice drills. Evelyn did a quick visual count as they moved toward the hallway. Everyone accounted for, except the 3 students she was most concerned about. Benjamin, Alex, and David had hung back, ostensibly helping to make sure no one left personal items behind. As the last of the other students disappeared into the hallway, Benjamin approached Evelyn with that same smile he'd worn the day before. "Miss Luna," he said, "we noticed you left some chemical supplies unsecured in the storage area. Probably should check on that before we evacuate. Right safety first." Every instinct Evelyn had developed over 6 years of military service was screaming that this was wrong. The storage area Benjamin was referring to was a large supply closet at the far end of the chemistry wing, well away from any evacuation route. There was no reason to check it during a fire drill, and certainly no reason for students to be concerned about it. But she was still thinking like a teacher, not like a Navy SEAL. "The supplies are fine. Benjamin," she said, "we need to evacuate now. School policy requires—" "Just take a quick look," Alex interrupted, moving to block her path to the hallway. "It'll only take a second." That's when Evelyn realized she was surrounded. David had moved behind her. Benjamin was to her left, and Alex was blocking the door. 3 18-year-old boys, each of them bigger than her, and all of them positioned like they'd planned this moment very carefully. "Move aside, please," Evelyn said, her voice carrying the authority she'd once used to command respect from elite military personnel. "We're evacuating, now," Benjamin laughed. "See, that's your problem. Miss Luna, you think you're in charge here. You think you can just waltz into our school and start throwing your weight around, failing people, making demands. But you're not in charge. You never were." The fire alarm was still wailing, and through the classroom windows, Evelyn could see streams of students and teachers heading toward the parking lot where they'd wait for the all-clear. The chemistry wing was empty except for the 4 of them, exactly as Benjamin had planned. "My dad tried to tell you nicely," Benjamin continued, taking a step closer. "He tried to explain how things work around here, but you didn't want to listen. So now you get to learn the hard way." Evelyn's training was starting to override her civilian instincts. She found herself automatically assessing the three boys as potential threats, calculating distances and angles, identifying improvised weapons within reach. The Bunsen burner on the lab table to her right, the fire extinguisher mounted on the wall behind David, the emergency chemical shower that could be activated to create confusion and opportunity. But she forced herself to stay calm. These were students, misguided, cruel students, but still children she was responsible for protecting, even from themselves. "Benjamin," she said, "whatever you're planning here, it's not worth the consequences. The school has cameras. There are protocols. People will notice we're missing from the evacuation point." "Oh, we're not missing," Alex said, pulling out his phone. "We evacuated. We're all safely outside right now, according to social media." He showed her the screen, which displayed a group selfie of the three boys standing in the parking lot with other students. Evelyn realized it must have been taken during a previous drill and saved for this moment. David produced a heavy chain and padlock from his backpack. "We just thought you might need some time to think about your attitude problem. Maybe spending a little while locked up will help you understand your place in the Roosevelt High School hierarchy." That's when Evelyn understood what was happening. They were going to force her into the supply closet and lock her in during the fire drill, leave her trapped and panicked while they provided themselves with alibis. It was psychological torture disguised as a prank, designed to humiliate her and demonstrate their power. It was also unlawful imprisonment, reckless endangerment, and potentially a felony depending on how long they planned to leave her locked up. "Last chance," Benjamin said. "You can walk into that closet voluntarily and think about how you want to change your approach to teaching, or we can make this more difficult for you." Evelyn looked at the three boys surrounding her and made a decision that would have surprised her 6 months earlier. She wasn't going to fight them. Not because she couldn't. Her Navy SEAL training had prepared her to neutralize threats much more dangerous than 3 teenagers. But because she was still trying to be the person she'd promised herself she would become when she left the military. "Fine," she said, "but when this is over, there will be consequences for all of you." Benjamin's grin widened. "We'll see about that." The supply closet was larger than a typical school storage space, probably 8 feet by 10 feet, lined with metal shelving units holding chemicals, lab equipment, and cleaning supplies. Under normal circumstances, it wouldn't have been a particularly threatening environment, but with the heavy fire door locked from the outside with a chain and padlock, it became something else entirely. Evelyn heard the chain rattle as Benjamin secured it, followed by the sound of their voices fading as they moved away. Then there was nothing but the muffled wail of the fire alarm and the sound of her own breathing. For the first few minutes, she remained calm. This was temporary, unpleasant, and illegal. But temporary. The fire drill would end. People would return to the building, and someone would eventually find her. Benjamin and his friends would face serious consequences for what they'd done, and this nightmare would finally be over. But as the minutes stretched on, something changed. The fire alarm stopped. Evelyn checked her phone. No signal, which wasn't surprising given the building's construction and her location deep in the interior. She tried the door again, confirming what she already knew. It was solid steel, hung on heavy hinges, and secured from the outside with hardware that would require tools or extraordinary force to defeat. She was trapped, and no one knew where she was. That's when she heard it, a voice, faint but unmistakable, coming through the building's ventilation system. "Help! Somebody, help me! I'm stuck!" "Madison Fisher," Evelyn recognized the voice immediately, though it was strained with panic and barely audible through the air ducts. "Please, the door won't open. I think something's burning." Evelyn pressed her ear to the vent near the ceiling, trying to determine Madison's location. The voice seemed to be coming from the direction of the student restrooms, which were on the same floor, but at the opposite end of the chemistry wing. "I'm in the bathroom by the library. The door handle broke and I can't get out. Please, somebody, help me." A chill ran down Evelyn's spine as she realized what was happening. The fire drill wasn't just a drill anymore. Something was actually wrong in the building. And Madison Fisher was trapped just like she was. But Madison didn't have 6 years of Navy SEAL training. The transformation that came over Evelyn Luna in that moment was something her students had never seen and never could have imagined. The mild-mannered chemistry teacher disappeared, replaced by someone who had been trained to survive and operate in the world's most dangerous environments. She began by assessing her resources. The supply closet contained an extensive collection of chemicals, many of which could be combined to create reactions ranging from useful to explosive. There were tools, not the kind designed for breaking down doors, but tools nonetheless. Glass beakers that could be broken into cutting implements, metal stands that could serve as levers or battering rams. Most importantly, there was knowledge. Evelyn knew things about chemistry that weren't covered in any high school curriculum. Knowledge gained from military applications where understanding how materials behaved under extreme conditions could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. She started with the door itself, running her hands along the frame to identify structural weak points. The hinges were on the outside, which eliminated that approach. The lock mechanism was similarly inaccessible, but the door frame was standard institutional construction, metal set into drywall anchored to wooden studs. Evelyn began pulling items from the shelves with the methodical efficiency of someone executing a well-rehearsed plan. Hydrochloric acid from the upper shelf, aluminum foil from the lab's supplies, a digital scale accurate to the gram, glass stirring rods that could be snapped into precise lengths. What she was planning was dangerous, not just because of the chemical reaction she was about to create, but because it would represent a fundamental shift in how she saw herself and her role in the world. For 8 months, she'd been Evelyn Luna, the teacher. But Madison Fisher's voice, echoing through the ventilation system, had awakened someone else entirely. "Help, please. I think there's really a fire." Madison's voice was weaker now, more panicked. Through the vents, Evelyn could hear what sounded like smoke alarms, not the building-wide fire drill alarm, but the local detectors that activated when they sensed actual smoke. Evelyn Luna, the teacher, would have waited for rescue, followed proper protocols, trusted that the system would work. But the person mixing precise quantities of acid and aluminum in a makeshift reaction chamber wasn't a teacher anymore. The chemical reaction she created was controlled but dramatic, a rapid decomposition that generated intense heat and expanding gases in a very specific direction. She used her knowledge of structural engineering to focus the force exactly where the door frame's mounting bolts connected to the wall studs. The explosion, when it came, was smaller than it sounded and more precise than anyone could have expected. The door frame separated from the wall with a grinding shriek of bent metal and cracked drywall, leaving the door itself undamaged but no longer secured to anything solid. Evelyn pushed through the opening she'd created and found herself in the empty hallway of the chemistry wing. Emergency lighting was on, and she could smell something that definitely wasn't part of a drill actual smoke, coming from the direction of the library. She ran. Madison Fisher was 17 years old, 5'4", and had been trapped in the second-floor girls' bathroom for nearly 20 minutes when the door handle had broken, leaving her locked inside during what she'd initially thought was just another routine fire drill. But the smoke seeping under the door and the sound of real alarms told her this wasn't routine at all. She'd screamed for help until her voice was hoarse, pounded on the door until her hands were bruised, and tried everything she could think of to force the door open. Nothing worked. The handle had broken in exactly the wrong way, leaving the locking mechanism engaged with no way to disengage it from the inside. Madison was crying and having trouble breathing when she heard a voice from the hallway. "Madison, are you in there?" It was Miss Luna, and she sounded different than Madison had ever heard her before. Not like a teacher trying to maintain classroom control, but like someone who was completely in command of a dangerous situation. "Miss Luna." "Yes, I'm stuck. The door won't open and I think there's a fire." "I know, sweetheart. I'm going to get you out. Move away from the door and cover your face." Madison pressed herself against the far wall and buried her face in her shirt just as something hit the bathroom door with tremendous force. Once, twice, 3 times. On the 4th impact, the door flew open, and Miss Luna stepped through. Except it wasn't really Miss Luna anymore. The woman standing in the doorway looked like her teacher, but moved like someone Madison had only seen in action movies. Her clothes were dirty and torn from her escape from the supply closet. Her hair had come loose from its professional ponytail, and there was something in her eyes that was both reassuring and slightly terrifying. "Are you hurt?" Evelyn asked, quickly examining Madison for injuries. "No, I'm okay. Just scared, Miss Luna. How did you—" "We need to move. Now." Evelyn grabbed Madison's hand and led her into the hallway, where the source of the smoke was immediately apparent. The library was burning, not a massive blaze, but a real fire that had started from an electrical malfunction in the computer lab and was spreading through the stacks of books and wooden furniture. "The fire department will be here soon," Evelyn said. "But we need to get out of this building right now." They ran toward the nearest exit. But as they rounded the corner toward the main stairwell, they encountered Benjamin Kennedy and his 2 friends coming back into the building. The look of shock on Benjamin's face when he saw Evelyn would have been comical under different circumstances. He'd left her locked in a supposedly escape-proof supply closet. And here she was, not only free, but somehow looking more dangerous than any teacher had a right to look. "Miss Luna?" Alex stammered. "How did you—" "Get out of my way," Evelyn said. Her voice carried an authority that made all 3 boys step aside reflexively. But Benjamin recovered quickly. The shock was replaced by anger, and the anger was fueled by the realization that his carefully planned humiliation had failed spectacularly. "You can't just—" he started to say. Evelyn turned to face him, and for the first time since this whole ordeal began, Benjamin Kennedy found himself looking into the eyes of someone who had killed people, someone who had been trained to end threats quickly and efficiently, someone who was done playing by rules that only protected bullies. "Benjamin," Evelyn said quietly, "you have approximately 30 seconds to get out of this building before the fire department arrives and starts asking questions about why you were inside during an evacuation. You have another 10 seconds after that, before I decide that you represent a threat to this student's safety." There was something in her tone that bypassed Benjamin's conscious mind and spoke directly to the part of his brain responsible for recognizing predators, for the first time in his life. Benjamin Kennedy was afraid of the consequences of his actions, but he was also 18 years old, stupid with privilege, and surrounded by friends who were watching his humiliation. Instead of taking the escape route Evelyn had offered him, he made the worst decision of his life. "You can't threaten students," he said, trying to regain his footing. "I'll tell my father. I'll tell everyone. You'll never work in education again." Evelyn looked at him for a long moment, then reached into her pocket and pulled out her phone. She scrolled through her contacts and selected a number, then put the call on speaker. "Springfield Police Department, how can I help you?" "This is Evelyn Luna at Roosevelt High School. I need to report multiple felonies in progress: unlawful imprisonment, reckless endangerment, and criminal mischief. The suspects are on site and I can identify them." Benjamin's face went white as he realized what was happening. This wasn't going to be handled through school administration or parental intervention. This was real law enforcement, real charges, real consequences. "Ma'am, are you safe?" the dispatcher asked. "I am now. The suspects are 3 male students, Benjamin Kennedy, Alex Morrison, and David Chen. They unlawfully imprisoned a teacher during a fire emergency, potentially endangering the life of another student who was trapped in the building." Madison was watching all of this with fascination and growing understanding. Miss Luna wasn't just rescuing her from a bathroom, she was systematically dismantling the power structure that had protected Benjamin Kennedy for his entire high school career. "Officers are on their way," the dispatcher said. "Please remain on the line." Benjamin made one last desperate attempt to regain control. "This is insane! We were just pranking you! It was just a joke." Evelyn looked at him with the kind of cold assessment she'd once reserved for enemy combatants. "Benjamin, you locked a teacher in a supply closet during a fire emergency, while I was trapped. Another student was genuinely in danger. If I hadn't been able to escape, Madison Fisher might have died of smoke inhalation." The word "died" hung in the air like a physical presence. For the first time, Benjamin seemed to grasp the actual magnitude of what he'd done. "We didn't know about her," Alex said weakly. "We didn't know there was a real fire." "That's exactly the point," Evelyn replied. "You created a dangerous situation without considering the consequences. That's the definition of reckless endangerment." Outside, they could hear sirens approaching, fire trucks, police cars, and probably ambulances. The cavalry was arriving. But the battle was already over, as they waited for the authorities. Evelyn did something that surprised everyone, including herself. She sat down on the hallway floor next to Madison and took a deep breath. "Are you okay?" she asked the girl gently. "Really okay? This was traumatic." Madison nodded, though she was still shaking. "Miss Luna, how did you get out of that closet? And how did you break down the bathroom door? You're like, different." Evelyn smiled for the first time that day. "I used to have a different job before I became a teacher. I was in the Navy. Like, on a ship. Something like that." The first police officer through the door was a woman in her 40s, who took one look at the scene and immediately understood the dynamics. Evelyn rose to meet her, suddenly looking like a teacher again, rather than whatever she'd been during the previous 30 minutes. "Officer Martinez," the woman introduced herself. "I understand there's been an incident." What followed was a methodical documentation of everything that had happened. Security cameras had captured Benjamin's group forcing Evelyn toward the supply closet. Their social media posts provided evidence of premeditation. The chain and padlock were still in place, proving the unlawful imprisonment charge. Most damning of all was Madison's testimony. She'd been trapped in genuine danger while the people responsible for her safety were either locked up or fled the building. The fact that a real fire had occurred during their prank transformed what might have been dismissed as teenage mischief into serious criminal charges. Benjamin Kennedy, Alex Morrison, and David Chen were arrested on the spot. Not suspended, not given detention, not sent to the principal's office. Arrested, handcuffed, and charged with felonies. Frederick Kennedy arrived as his son was being loaded into a police car. The principal, who had spent months protecting Benjamin from consequences, watched helplessly as real consequences finally caught up with his family. "This is an overreaction," he told Officer Martinez. "Boys will be boys. Surely we can handle this administratively." "Sir," Officer Martinez replied, "your son and his friends unlawfully imprisoned a teacher during a fire emergency, potentially endangering the life of another student. This isn't a school discipline matter. This is criminal behavior." The next few hours passed in a blur of statements, interviews, and paperwork. The fire department confirmed that there had been a real electrical fire in the library, which made Benjamin's group responsible not just for imprisoning Evelyn, but for creating a situation where someone could have died. Madison Fisher's parents arrived and were horrified to learn how close their daughter had come to serious injury. They immediately retained an attorney and filed both criminal complaints and a civil lawsuit against Benjamin, his friends, and the school district for failing to protect their daughter. The story was picked up by local news outlets within hours. "Students arrest teacher during fire emergency" was the kind of headline that generated immediate outrage and attention. By evening, it had spread to social media, where the combination of bullying, endangerment, and a teacher with military training created a viral sensation. But for Evelyn Luna, the most important moment came 3 days later, during an assembly that had been hastily organized by the school board. Diana Peterson, the assistant principal, introduced Evelyn to an auditorium full of students, teachers, and parents. Many of them had heard rumors about what happened, but few knew the full story. Evelyn walked to the podium, looking once again like the mild-mannered chemistry teacher they'd known for 8 months. But there was something different about her now, something that commanded attention and respect in a way that had nothing to do with fear. "3 days ago," she began, "some students at this school learned an important lesson about consequences, but I want to talk to all of you about a different kind of lesson." She paused, looking out at the faces in the audience. In the third row, she could see Madison Fisher sitting with her parents. In the back, Vincent Walker was smiling slightly, proud of his colleagues' courage. Strength isn't about intimidating people or using power to hurt others. Real strength is about protecting people who can't protect themselves. It's about standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult. She told them about her military service, about the skills she'd learned and the reasons she'd chosen to leave that life behind. She talked about the importance of creating communities where everyone felt safe, where power was used responsibly, and where actions had consequences. "Benjamin Kennedy and his friends are facing serious criminal charges," she said. "Not because I wanted revenge, but because what they did was genuinely dangerous. Madison Fisher could have been seriously hurt or killed because of their actions." She looked directly at the students in the audience, many of whom were hearing about the real consequences of bullying for the first time. "If you take nothing else from this story, remember this: there are always people watching who are stronger than you think, more capable than they appear, and more committed to justice than you might expect. The quiet person you're considering targeting might be the person who ends up protecting everyone else from you." The assembly ended with sustained applause, but the real impact came in the weeks that followed. Benjamin Kennedy was sentenced to 2 years in juvenile detention and would have to register the felony conviction when he turned 18. Alex Morrison and David Chen received shorter sentences but faced the same permanent consequences. Frederick Kennedy was fired as principal and faced his own charges for administrative negligence. The school district paid a substantial settlement to Madison Fisher's family and implemented new anti-bullying policies with real teeth. Most importantly, Roosevelt High School became a different place. Students who had been quietly suffering under various forms of intimidation began speaking up. Teachers felt empowered to address problems they'd previously ignored. The culture of protection for privileged students was replaced by actual accountability. Evelyn Luna continued teaching chemistry at Roosevelt High School, but she was no longer the same person who had walked those hallways 8 months earlier. She started a self-defense club for students and teachers. She worked with law enforcement to create educational programs about the serious legal consequences of harassment and intimidation, and sometimes, when she was alone in her classroom at the end of the day, she would look at the photo on her desk, her old Navy SEAL team. The people who had taught her that strength without purpose was just violence. But strength in service of others was something worth dedicating your life to. Evelyn Luna had found a way to be both the warrior she'd been trained to be and the teacher she'd chosen to become. And Roosevelt High School was safer for everyone because of it. 3 months after the incident, Madison Fisher stopped by Evelyn's classroom after school. "Miss Luna," she said, "I wanted to thank you again for saving me, but I also wanted to ask you something." "What's that?" "Madison, when you were in the Navy, were you scared sometimes?" Evelyn smiled. "All the time. But being scared isn't the opposite of being brave. Being brave means doing what's right even when you're scared." Madison nodded thoughtfully. "I'm thinking about joining ROTC next year. Maybe the military after college." "That's a big decision," Evelyn said. "But I think you'd be good at it. You've already shown you can stay calm under pressure." As Madison left the classroom, Evelyn reflected on the strange turns life could take. She'd left the military to escape violence and find peace in teaching. Instead, she'd discovered that sometimes the best way to serve others was to be prepared to fight for them. The supply closet had been repaired and restocked. The bathroom door had a new handle. The burn damage in the library had been restored, but Roosevelt High School would never be the same. And that was exactly as it should be. 6 months later, Evelyn stood in the same hallway where Benjamin Kennedy had once cornered her, watching a group of freshmen excitedly discuss their upcoming science fair projects. The energy was different now. Lighter. More genuine. Students walked with confidence instead of fear, and teachers moved through the corridors without the underlying tension that had once permeated every interaction. Vincent Walker approached, carrying coffee from the faculty lounge. "Heard from Madison lately?" he asked. "She got accepted to the Naval Academy." Evelyn replied, unable to hide her pride. "Early admission. Apparently, her essay about courage under pressure really impressed the admissions board." "Wonder where she got that inspiration," Vincent said with a knowing smile. Evelyn looked down at her hand, the same hands that had once been trained to kill, that had mixed chemicals to break through a door, that now guided teenagers through molecular equations and periodic tables. For the first time since leaving the Navy, she felt completely at peace with who she was. "You know," she said to Vincent, "I used to think I had to choose between being a warrior and being a teacher. Turns out, sometimes they're the same thing." The bell rang, and students began filing into her classroom, chattering about the day's experiment. Evelyn Luna, chemistry teacher, former Navy SEAL, protector of the innocent, smiled, and followed them inside. Some battles, she had learned, were worth fighting after all. If this story moved you, please consider liking and subscribing to help me share more stories about ordinary people who find extraordinary courage when it matters most. These tales of justice and resilience remind us that heroes come in all forms. And sometimes, the most powerful person in the room is the one who chooses to use their strength to protect others rather than harm them. Your support helps me continue bringing you real stories that matter. Stories that inspire us to be better and to stand up for what's right. Thank you for listening. And thank you for believing that justice is possible when good people refuse to stay silent.